The next presentation, which is equally exciting, is from Akhona Nkenkana. She is a researcher working for the UNICEF, that's it. This thing, you see, 50 years of June 16, does wonders on people. UNICEF. Her work is really on social inclusion. She is passionate with data analysis. She does a lot of evidence-based research with the ultimate objective to try and introduce content that can impact on legislation and policy. And if we just capture what Prof was saying, that we have an education system, but I think somehow we delay on getting data and getting evidence-based information that says to us, we're going the right trajectory, we're not going the right trajectory, we're including people, we're excluding people. The cost of education in terms of NSFAS is increasing. Mare hariboni hore bana ba rona, they get absorbed by this economy. We need to ask those questions. The alumni, all of ourselves, the veterans, and the class of 26. Let's keep asking those questions. And her work is about revealing what data says. Nobody can query research data unless utsama o etsa gago research. O ka se re research ya ka e wrong. Tsamo etsa gago be re compare. Yeah, so I want to introduce her to come to the podium and give us her presentation. Akhona, you're welcome.
Molweni, dumelang. As I was preparing for this August gathering and for this profound reflection of the journey we have walked as a country to 1976, I didn't quite anticipate that I would actually get here and not hear a single gwijo about this day. And so perhaps to the DJs and perhaps to the floor, just one for me to rejuvenate myself and remember myself that I am actually in Soweto. But I don't know how to sing, and I am hoping that when I start, the floor would actually quickly catch the song. Zeni bambeni, bambeni we bafa. Zeni bambeni. Zeni bambeni. Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen, and to the program director. To the Tsietsi Mashinini family, the past and the present Morris Isaacson High School family, the youth of South Africa, and the distinguished guests present here. Greetings this afternoon. We gather here today 50 years after the events of June 1976, as Prof has indicated, a defining moment in our history. The students who marched through the streets of Soweto and other parts of South Africa confronted an education system designed not to liberate, but to subordinate. They challenged the system that denied them dignity, limited their opportunities, and sought to control not only what they learned, but also what they understood themselves and the world around them. While their struggle was about language, but it was also about power, about knowledge, about equality, the right of a meaningful education. 50 years later, we honor their courage, yet the greatest tribute we can offer is not remembrance alone. It is an honest assessment of whether the educational injustices they opposed have truly been overcome 50 years later. That assessment must begin not with sentiments, but from my end with evidence. As it has been indicated, I'm quite passionate about issues of data. If we are serious about understanding the state of education in South Africa today, we must be willing to confront what the data tells us. The evidence is certainly sobering. I think the questions to Prof's presentation has also in some way touched to some of those sobering issues. If we are serious about understanding then this, what is it that we need to do? Approximately about 81% of grade 4 learners cannot read for meaning. And I think the early learning question came from 3 or 4 questions on the floor already, the issue of early learning and ECD in general. More than 1 million of children who enter grade 1 will not complete grade 12. That's what the data tells us. And where do those who fall in the crack end up in? Those are the questions that we need to ponder. So across the system, educational outcomes continue to reflect deep inequalities associated with geography, with language, with socioeconomic status, and historical patterns of exclusion. These are not merely indicators of poor performance, they are indicators of unequal life chances. They reveal that while access to education has expanded significantly since the dawn of our democracy, access alone has not translated into meaningful learning for millions of children in South Africa. Indeed, one of the most important lessons from the last 3 decades is that enrollment is not the same as educational success. Attendance is not the same as learning, and policy intentions are not the same as policy outcomes. This therefore raises a critical question for all of us. Why? Why, despite progressive legislation, substantial public investments, and successive waves of reforms, do these inequalities persist? I'll put this here because the nerves when you are on the stage would require me to actually go back in there and forget that I have read it already. So a common explanation is usually pointed towards implementation issues, right? Especially around issues of policy. According to this view, our policies are fundamentally sound, but their execution is quite weak. This is something that we know across board around issues of progressive policies in South Africa, but challenges with implementation. There is undoubtedly truth about that argument. Capacity constraints, administrative weakness, resource limitations, and governance failures continue to affect educational delivery in our country. I'm sure the principals and the teachers in this room would agree greatly about that one. Worth noting, though, is that evidence suggests that implementation alone cannot explain the scale and the persistence of the crisis we face in our education system in the country. 50 years after 1976, many of the inequalities embedded within a colonial and apartheid education system remains visible in different forms. Patterns of privileges and disadvantages continue to shape educational outcomes. Schools serving poor communities frequently face challenges that extend beyond funding alone, including weaker institutional capacity, limited access to learning resources, and persistent barriers to academic success. The question before us, therefore, is not simply whether policies are being implemented effectively. It is whether the underlying structure that produce unequal outcomes have been fundamentally transformed in South Africa. This is where the legacy of 1976 becomes particularly important. The students of 1976 challenged more than a language policy. They challenged an educational order that determined whose knowledge mattered, whose voices were valued, and whose future were prioritized. Today, the struggle for educational justice remains inseparable from the question of language, knowledge, power, and institutional inequality. These issues continue to shape who succeeds, who struggles, and whose experience remain invisible within the education system. Nevertheless, if we are to address the challenges effectively, we require more than a critique. We require evidence. Moreover, this is where education data becomes indispensable. Too often, educational debates are dominated by political rhetoric, ideological contestations, or reactive interventions. Decisions are made in response to public pressure, media attention, or institutional interests that rather than systematic evidence at times. So when reliable information is absent, inequalities become difficult to identify systematically. Interventions become difficult to target, and accountability becomes too difficult to enforce. In such circumstances, educational failures can persist without being adequately measured or addressed. For this reason, which is something that my current experience in the work I am currently grappling with as I work on the education management information systems in general, the power that they actually hold when they are actually implemented effectively and managed effectively. They are not merely technical tools or administrative tools. They are essential instruments for educational justice that we need in our country. Effective education data systems across the globe, they allow us to identify where learners are being left behind, understand why inequalities persist and where they persist, and evaluate whether interventions are working and ensure the resources are directed where they are mostly needed. But now, if data is an afterthought to the interventions required, and then the powerful intervention that could actually be used using those systems becomes ineffective. Most importantly, they make inequalities visible. Any teacher or anyone who has access to the education management information system in this room, they would know what I am talking about, because all of those are reflected on MEs and the data that they use within the country. Without credible and integrated data systems, educational disadvantage can remain hidden behind aggregate statistics and policy declarations. We have education statistics that are reported from surveys, for instance, from Statistics South Africa, when we are sitting with the education management information system that collects that data on an annual basis, that could actually give us the numbers that we actually get from surveys at times. Without robust data systems, however, we are able to move beyond assumptions and confront some of the realities we are facing. We can measure learning outcomes rather than simple enrollment. We can identify schools requiring urgent support rather than relying on anecdotes. We can evaluate policy effectiveness rather than assuming success. In addition, we can hold institutions accountable for results rather than intentions. Yet, data alone is not enough. I could stand here and advocate for data, but I know that it is not enough when it is approached alone. The question is not merely whether information exists, but whether it is trusted, it is accessible, it is integrated and used to inform decision-making. A democratic education system requires a democratic evidence infrastructure. I am saying this because there is, in the data conversations, we are talking about data interoperability. We might be talking about this now in 2026, but evidence from the ministries have shown that they have actually been doing that long before we actually have this conversation. The data that is collected in the school management information system is important and can be validated against the data that is collected by social development to ensure that the kids are getting the social services, and also validate that information against the Department of Home Affairs with the data that is simply collected by one institution. And so the strengthening of this institution is important for that interoperability exercise. Teachers, school learners, communities, researchers, and policymakers must all be able to engage with evidence in ways that strengthen accountability and improve educational outcomes. We now know that there is a pre-approval process that NSFAS does for students who are actually entering education. And that is because they get that data from social development to understand who are the students or who are the learners who have been part of the social grant system, and those automatically get the pre-approval. But if the systems are not strengthened and that system is not, a child could not get that service on the basis that they were actually not properly registered, or that data did not infiltrate through to some of the systems. And so the relationship of these systems is very crucial for some of the improvements that we want to see, both in education and social services in general. So in this sense, the democratization of educational data is itself a matter of justice. To count every learner is to recognize them. It's not enough just to count them. To measure inequality honestly is to refuse the normalized issues of missing information. To make educational outcomes visible is to create the possibility of transformation. The challenge before us is therefore both analytical and political. We must strengthen our ability to understand educational realities while we simultaneously building the institutional capacity required to change them. This demands a clear set of prioritization. To me, and it could be different to someone else, I think the questions about foundational literacy has become more a national imperative. I would not even dwell much on this because the questions on the floor spoke quite extensively on this, or revealed the need for foundational learning to be strengthened in one way or the other. And of course, the issue of resource allocation, and I think Prof did speak to this in his presentation as well. This must become equitable and more responsive to evidence. Historical disadvantage cannot be overcome through equal treatment alone. It requires targeted investments, at times informed by reliable data. And third, the issue of language policy reform must support learning while affirming dignity and identity. The aspirations of 1976 remind us that the language remains central to educational inclusion and educational justice. And these a lot of studies have come out to actually make this point quite clearly, that the issues of comprehension that we actually have is because the learners are taught in languages that are not of their own, and so the relativity that is required is not there. And yet, when you see in some of the surveys, the students who are learning and who are assessed in their language, they actually tend to progress more than when they are assessed either in English or Afrikaans. So that is the important thing about this. And so the fourth is on the institutional accountability. This must extend beyond compliance and reporting. Schools, district, provinces, and national departments must be accountable for educational outcomes and internal success. And the fifth and the last for me is South Africa must invest stronger, integrated and democratized educational information systems capable of supporting evidence-driven governance across the entire education sector. These priorities are interconnected because none can fully succeed without the other. And so the integrated and democratized educational information systems are capable of supporting evidence governance across the education sector. These priorities together, they present a shift from managing education to, in fact, transforming it. Most importantly, they represent a shift from symbolism to accountability. The lesson of 1976 is not that educational injustices disappear with political change. The lesson is that justice requires continuous vigilance, continuous struggle, and continuous transformation. As we reflect on the last 50 years, we should acknowledge the substantial gains that have been made. Millions more children attend school. Educational opportunities have expanded. Discriminatory legislation have been dismantled. And I think the SRC president of the school alluded to this point. However, we must also recognize that access without learning, inclusion without success, and policy without accountability cannot fulfill the aspiration of those who marched in 1976. The unfinished promise of educational justice demands more. It demands that we move beyond measuring participation to measuring learning itself, beyond celebrating policy commitments to evaluating policy outcomes, beyond commemorating history to transforming present realities, informed by the history we are commemorating. In addition, beyond rhetoric to evidence-based accountability. Ultimately, if we were to honor the legacy of 1976, would be required the political courage to build an education system in which every child, regardless of geography, race, language, gender, or class, can read for meaning. Because those who cannot read and write, you can trace them by their geography, by their class, and by their social status in society. The students of 1976 demanded dignity, equality, and epistemic justice. 50 years later, our responsibility is clear. We must build an education system capable not only of remembering their struggle, but of fulfilling its unfinished promise. I thank you.